It's great to have you joining us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. I'm host Carrie Freeman, coming to you in early June of 2025, and I'm excited to talk to my professor friend Hanna Morris, who I know from our participation in the International Environmental Communication Association, IECA, and she has a new book out with Oxford University Press with a provocative focus for these troubled, politically polarized times. It's called Apocalyptic Authoritarianism, Climate Crisis, Media, and Power. Stay tuned to In Tune to Nature if you're concerned about global warming and wonder why American news outlets cover it as they do, or sometimes they don't cover it. Dr. Morris will tell us how conservative politics and key stories have influenced that climate coverage since Trump's first presidency in unproductive ways by using their own total crisis narrative for a quick fix by authorities and villainizing the quote unquote woke climate activists on the political left, especially women of color, who are proposing more transformative social change rather than a quick fix. Dr. Morris puts this in historical context of America's colonial mandate for manifest destiny to possess and control the continent. These old American identities of white male entitlement and political order still have power today. But Morris has ideas for how more robust climate journalism that challenges privileged authority figures, respects the wisdom of the public, and acknowledges the slow and fast violences of the climate crisis, how that can foster the kinds of democratic and humane responses the climate crisis warrants. Will we rise to the occasion? Dr. Hanna Morris is an assistant professor in the School of the Environment at University of Toronto after getting graduate degrees from the London School of Economics and University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School of Communication. Her website is hannamorris.com, and there's no H on the end, so it's Hanna, hannamorris.com. Welcome, Dr. Morris.
Hi, thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, we've gotten to meet several times, not just in our Zoom meetings for the International Environmental Communication Awards Committee, but also every few years we meet at the Conference on Communication and the Environment. And then this year, the conference is coming up in a few weeks in Tasmania, Australia, and we're both attending in person. Outside the conference, like, what are you excited to see and do when you're in Australia?
Yeah, I can't wait. I'm really excited. It's just such a privilege to be able to travel so far and be able to take advantage of being there and see all of the really great cultural and also wildlife
Yes.
wildlife there. So definitely my plan is to try and see a Tasmanian devil. That would be great while
Oh,
there.
wow. That's
Yeah.
ambitious, but yes.
Yeah, I'll be on the lookout. So
Yeah. I'm mostly interested in wombats, like fat, furry, marsupial type animals too. The patty melons, who are like the small kangaroos. But yeah, the Tasmanian devil is also a furry little fat guy who's adorable and kind of feisty. So that would be awesome. I'm going over to Maria Island at some point, which is an island off the island of Tasmania. And I think when I'm there, I might see some wombats and some other animals. Or I'm going to Cradle Mountain National Park and Freycinet National Park. So I'm kind of hoping that I just will come across some of these animals along the way. But yeah, we'll see. Now, do you sometimes feel embarrassed to tell people you're flying to Australia for a conference on environmental protection because it sounds hypocritical because of all the fossil fuels?
yeah, yeah, definitely. And that's something that is just really challenging because of the importance and need to collectively come together and have a community and build these strong alliances and talk. And it's really something magical about being in person and also just learning from a different culture by being there. So I definitely, it's not good flying so
Yeah.
far. And so my plan is to just take full advantage and spend as much time there as possible and really be there and make contacts, build friendships, see wombats, and just
Yeah.
full advantage of the kind of once in a lifetime opportunity to be there.
I agree that like yes, because I'm going to be there almost 3 weeks because right when you're using that many resources and money to get over to a place, you want to really see it and not just turn around and come right back home, right when the conference is done. So, yeah, make the most of it, see as much, meet as many people as you can, and enjoy the experience. And then that means you're not flying somewhere else to go on vacation because you're flying to a conference and you're making it this your vacation. So that's some of the ways. But also in looking up carbon offsetting for the organizing committee for the conference, it wasn't clear how effective those programs are. But our conference organizers said, and this is a quote from their the website, a portion of the net proceeds from the conference on communication and the environment will be donated to the Tasmanian Land Conservancy. This organization protects Tasmania's unique ecosystems by purchasing and managing private land for conservation. And also, the conference itself is vegan and vegetarian, so it's avoiding most animal products. So that's a great way to reduce carbon emissions and conserve water as well. So that's kind of what they did instead of just saying, you should plant trees somewhere else. They're saying, let's give money to local conservation in the place we're going. So that might be a way for anyone flying in the future to say, like, okay, where am I going, and can I give to wildlife preservation in that area? Yeah.
I think that's great. Yeah, such a great idea. And also just furthering learning about the place you're going to. So it's not just flying in and out, but actually really taking full opportunity to learn as much as you can about the local place and support it. So I think that's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. And our the conference always has excursions too in the middle, which is kind of like where they get us out of the building. And so there's like some kind of nature conservancy walk that I'm going on for that. So yeah, so that's nice to kind of go visit wilderness refuges and give money to them when you're there. Okay, Dr. Morris, let's get talking about the findings from your book. This book, Apocalyptic Authoritarianism, Climate Crisis, Media, and Power. It was based on your dissertation, right? Your doctoral dissertation?
It was. And yeah, apologies for the difficult to say apocalyptic authoritarianism. It's definitely
I
a
love
mouthful.
it. Yeah. Well, it's so provocative. I think it's a great title. Now, what was your path to coming to this topic? Did it all start years ago when your parents got you that dry erase board so you could teach your stuffed animals about sea turtles?
Yeah, definitely my path for being a professional nerd was set pretty early. Yeah, when I was young, I was really obsessed with sea turtles and really attuned to environmental concerns from a very young age. My parents actually recently retired and moved to Arizona, and they were going through all of my old school stuff, and they found these old business cards I made that said Dr. Morris, PhD
Whoa.
turtles. So I don't know when I made that. I wish there was a PhD in sea turtles, but my PhD ended up being communication. Again, my professional nerd path was sedimented early on. And I just always really saw the power of media
Yeah.
and the ability to really, discuss and think about and learn about different environmental concerns through media. And so my path started from a very early age where I was really influenced by really strong media that showed the plight of sea turtles and then
Yeah.
just turned into really a lifelong interest in this relationship between media and the environment.
And how did you come to the idea for your dissertation on like studying the climate crisis through the media, but also through the lens of like Democratic and Republican tensions?
Yeah, yeah. So I started college right after the financial crash and really the burgeoning Occupy movement. And I saw from my experience and being a part of the Occupy movement, really amazing opportunities to collectively come together and think about climate change through a justice perspective too. And so understand the root causes of climate change is a part of um, a pretty dysfunctional political economic system. And I just I found a lot of optimism and community from collectives coming together. But then, just a handful of years later, there was the Trump election and this really strong reactionary response to a lot of progressive movement building that happened in the years prior. And it was quite shocking, but maybe it shouldn't have been shocking. And just really seeing this disconnect that was happening between progressive spaces and the sort of reactionary responses to that and how the media was covering and framing these different parts of society and the sort of disconnect with media and people. And so my interests really, because of these political events I was living through, really shaped my interest in trying to figure out what was going on and why there was this interest in an authoritarian aspiring president, like how this came to be.
Yeah, because this was around the bulk of your study was from around 2016 to maybe was it 2023? So part of it goes into Biden's era as well. Um, and then, yeah, and then he got Trump got reelected. I don't know if we saw that coming. Yeah, and so were you primarily studying news outlets, or were you also, I mean, I know you bring in historical, so there's lots of scholarly references too, but were you looking at like The Guardian and the New York Times, or how did you study that?
Yeah, so that was exactly what you said about how, just to return to what you said with how Trump came back.
Yeah,
And so, I started my project really interested in how did Trump come to be in the first place, especially
yeah.
with these really strong progressive movements, there's a lot of momentum around climate justice and climate change. How did this happen? And then he came back again,
Uh,
question renewed. My book really kind of shows and looks at this question of how and why this reactionary movement happened again, but in such a short amount of time, just in these 4 years that Biden was president, instead of really building these strong coalitions across different groups, I found, and by looking at a lot of mainstream news media, so I looked at mostly what I am referring to as traditional journalism. So
yes.
from New York Times, Wall Street Journal, also looking at though really big prominent news magazines across the ideological spectrum. So Newsweek, Time, but also looking at The Nation and on the more of the left, and then the National Review on the right. I looked at over 20 publications in total, and yes, between this period of 2015 and 2023, to really reckon with and see, how and why when there was so much interest in climate change, there was so much potential for these coalitions and movement building. What happened? Why is there this continued Trump emergence? And how maybe looking at the news media, how there can be some answers are provided. And I think that's what motivated my study and what my ultimate argument was.
Right, because he's a climate denier. And so like if we had a strong climate movement and if people felt that that was something they was important enough them to vote on, you wouldn't vote in somebody that was going to do nothing but exacerbate the problem. So, yeah. Now the concept in your title, apocalyptic authoritarianism, where did that come from and what does apocalyptic authoritarianism mean? That's two depressing words coupled together, but nice alliteration.
Yeah, no, definitely whenever everyone asks me what's your book called and I say apocalyptic authoritarianism, there's, a range of a range of
It's not
reactions.
like beach reading. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a little bit heavy,
Yeah.
but I mean, it's just because of this interest in this question that I had in terms of, yeah, why, if there was so much concern about the environment. And so in 2019, for example, that's the year where climate change was at its peak. It was the first time in US history where there was extensive media coverage of climate change. This is 3 years into Trump's first presidency, too. So, there was this moment in the first Trump presidency where there was this period of just so much interest. And Yale University found that for the first time, too, the majority of Americans not only believed in climate change, which lasted far too long, this question of if climate change was real
Yeah.
and human caused. So the vast majority of Americans, for the first time in 2019, believed in climate change, but were also concerned about climate change now and wanted to do something about it. And consistently, ever since 2019, there's been poll after poll after poll showing that the majority of Americans want more government action to address climate change. But news media coverage didn't really reflect this. So even though there was in 2019, the first time there was extensive media coverage on climate change, it was up 73% in 2019 compared to just a year prior in 2018. So a real massive increase. There was this moment that climate change sort of trended. It was the word of the year by Oxford Dictionaries in 2019, for example. So, and this was also when the Green New Deal really came in and provided this alternative vision for how to respond to climate change in a way that addressed both the authoritarian posturing of Trump And also the what I mentioned with the Occupy movement and post-financial crash, a real strong, robust, democratic way of changing the political economic system so that it is more equitable, more people are included in decision making around climate change. So there's all this radical potential and all this interest. And instead of really engaging with that and featuring all these different perspectives, really leaning into all of his interest, a lot of journalism I found in these mainstream publications really painted the present as apocalyptic in terms of it just being really hard to decipher how climate change came to be and how to respond. It was just sort of subsumed in this apocalyptic disarray. And it's here where I introduced the term apocalyptic authoritarianism to to really describe what I found in terms of the impact of this sort of zoomed out apocalyptic rendering as opposed to leaning in and contextualizing and really engaging with the politics of the moment. And so this term apocalyptic authoritarianism I use to describe the really reactionary posturing and political alignments of traditionally privileged figures from the right, but also to the center as well, who were united around this common enemy of the new left and apocalyptic fears of total crisis. And within this, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was a big proponent of the Green New Deal, all the activists who were really excited about the Green New Deal, were painted as villainous impediments to national recovery and stability, as opposed to leaders really showing how politics could be different.
Yeah, and the word authoritarianism, like I associate that with the Trump regime because that's how we're seeing a lot of, news stories now interviewing people who write books about fascism and study fascism and see that the United States is maybe moving in an authoritarianism direction that we haven't before. So, but I think I'm maybe that's not exactly what you're talking about here.
Well, it is. It's more of this question of how is it that some folks who consider themselves to be liberal are moving more towards the right and are supporting more authoritarian forms of government, as opposed to really, supporting visions such as a Green New Deal, which are robustly democratic, involve a lot of different forms of expertise, bottom-up decision making as opposed to top-down, which would disrupt traditional centers of authority. And so Naomi Klein, for example, in her relatively new book, Doppelganger, talks about this movement that has happened where folks who traditionally consider themselves to be liberal or moderates have moved more and more towards the right and are aligning more and more with these reactionary figures. And the problem with that is that it's just leading to a really large group of traditionally privileged figures who have a lot of power who are fear-mongering about young progressives and especially young women of color who are leading these important movements for climate justice and really different ways of thinking about how American politics can be different. These young women are historically marginalized groups. So the problem is that there's this further marginalization of historically marginalized groups with at the same time the centering of historically privileged groups. Traditional centers of power are really entrenching and digging their heels into their authority and saying, you need to follow us. The nation's at risk of extremism. We're at risk of losing ourselves if we let young progressives take control. So there's this movement to the right among, which is kind of surprising among some
Yeah.
folks that you think would be moving towards the right.
Yeah. Although we do see, I mean, this isn't in your book probably, but like recently, Bernie Sanders and AOC have been getting large crowds when they go out and speak. And so, and some of the people that would have, it seems like Bernie Sanders can capture some Trump voters and vice versa. So it's kind of interesting. And he is unapologetically far left. Yeah, I used to think he was unelectable, and now I realize I was wrong. I thought, oh, Hillary Clinton was electable. And then, but I actually think, maybe Bernie Sanders was what we needed, even though I was kind of afraid, it wasn't. But maybe because I'm also hearing the same things on the news that he's too radical or different things, regardless of my own politics being very progressive too. There's always that pragmatism we have about, well, who can actually, yeah, that would be nice if we could get all of these things or universal health care or, all these things, but we think, oh, well, we can't realistically do that, so we need to go with the safe choice or whatever. Now, For your book research, what are some of the narratives on the political right or in American identity that have had a lot of traction, but they've been problematic for resolving the global warming crisis?
Yeah, it kind of taps into what you were just saying, where there's this almost capitalizing upon this fear of like the masses, or, not wanting to, or sort of this myth that, yeah, you need a moderate approach, or
Mhm.
you need a traditional approach,
Yes.
a traditional figure, because if there's mass politics, then the nation will be in disarray. And so this is a common media narrative. It is quite conservative in terms of sedimenting more traditional centers of power, a patriarchal figure who can calm
Mhm.
the woman and the children, and sort of this, you know, really leaning into and leaning back towards this nostalgia for what's imagined as being a US golden age where, white men's personal privilege was less under public debate and more solid. And this reactivation of these images of, in particular, in climate news stories, I found this reactivation of the post-World War II period. So immediately after World War II and before the mass civil rights movements and radical politics of the late 1960s and 70s, there's this period right after World War II and between these important progressive movements where a lot of traditional figures in climate journalism, so from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal, and moderate political figures like Joe Biden to Trump, but Trump is now actually romanticizing even further back to when women didn't even
It's
have
the
any
1890s.
power. Yeah, he's moving further and further back. But really this Make America Great Again, the first iteration was harkening back to sort of the 1950s, after World War II. And really say in these stories of climate change, though, how they've been taken up, is really positioning this as this is the right way to respond to climate change. We need to look to the past where the US was a global superpower. It was society was more stable, there was less unease. We need to think back and look back to this period to guide our way out of climate change and also in more centrist newspapers out of climate change and the Trump chaos. And so looking back to this post-war period, but the problem with that, again, is that this was before there was mass multiracial politics and democracy. This was a period where traditional figures of power, male figures of power, were more centered and revered and in positions of authority. And so uh, I'm arguing that this romanticization and nostalgia for this period is problematic because it limits the imagining of politics differently and politics that are more robustly democratic and ways of responding to climate change that are different than the post-war way of responding to things. So it's interesting seeing how in sort of more moderate political and news media and on more conservative political discourse and news media, there is some convergence in some surprising ways that I was surprised to see in my study, in my book project, and just this alliance, this reactionary alliance that really is used to prevent engaging with more progressive ways of thinking about politics and this fear mongering that is activated over and over again to say, these new directions are being proposed are gonna suspend us into deeper crisis, a deeper apocalypse, and we need to look backwards as opposed to thinking about something different.
Is that part of, I know you found some tropes kind of in the news media coverage of climate change. And like one of them was appeals to nationalism and discursive processes of othering. Is that kind of what you're describing in a sense when you say othering, like the othering of progressive activists and progressive politicians like AOC and some of the other, a lot of members of the House of Representatives who are women of color? Are they othered as like, oh, they aren't the solution because that's too radical, this Green New movie, it's too radical. Let's kind of go back to just some kind of clean energy narrative or something?
Yeah, yeah, there's this real nationalism that is again, kind of surprising, but from looking at my, study overall, it makes sense. But at first, surprising seeing this really strong nationalism even what are considered more center-left publications, the reactivation of, for example, Rosie the Riveter images to show how we should mobilize to quote unquote defeat climate change and war on warming and sort of these war narratives that are reactivated but in a very nationalistic way. And it kind of it's used and it can be appropriated and also directly used to say, we don't have time for these other visions. We don't
Mm.
have time for these young progressives and what they're saying. We need to act now, and we have the technology. We have past examples of when the US was glorious and stable and a world leader. We know what we need to do, and this is what we need to do. But these are traditionally privileged, usually white dudes who are saying this,
Yeah.
and it's visions, and it's not necessarily what is going to lead to a really fundamental reckoning with climate change that involves a deeper, a deeper change in the way politics are done, and it needs a lot more people to be involved, a lot more lived experiences with climate change. It's not a simple 1 + 1 = 2. That's the solution to climate
Yeah.
change. It's much more complicated than that.
And part of it is like you're talking about a deeper look in terms of justice and climate justice and equity and dealing with the economic inequalities, or instead of maybe a more kind of market-based approach to like the climate crisis in terms of energy alone. And so things like a universal health care or other things that are aligned with with these social justice movements, I think are perhaps considered too scary or too radical or something. That's the way they're proposed. And so they want to keep it just related to technology fixes for the climate, but not actual economic justice for people who are most affected or environmental injustice kind of issues that are brought up as part of a more complex the whole complex web of the problem, because it also relates to our food systems and biodiversity crisis and all kinds of things. It's not just you go in and get solar panels or something.
Yeah, exactly. And also, too, these policies that are consistently in nationalistic terms, so traditional US nationalistic terms, which is very, since the Cold War, especially this capitalism versus communism, and US is capitalism, and then, foreign enemies or threats are communism. So you still see this Red Scare, fear-mongering applied to progressive movements. But, these more socialist policies are actually incredibly popular among the US population. And
Right.
again, this is what's really amazing to see is that poll after poll of, looking at what Americans across the political spectrum, geographical spectrum, states and rural city divides, there is a lot of agreement on what could be considered socialist policies. And these are popular. And so it actually is, this form of politics would involve again upending traditional centers of power and actually including more people in decision-making processes, which worries, of course, traditional figures of power, but would be really popular and
Yeah.
a really important way of addressing, yeah, interconnected societal issues and climate change as a part of these, not separate and not something that a tech fix can just solve.
Right. If you're just joining us on Radio Free Georgia, this is In Tune to Nature, and I'm host Carrie Freeman talking with Dr. Hanna Morris, assistant professor at the School of the Environment at the University of Toronto, and author of the Oxford University Press book Apocalyptic Authoritarianism, Climate Crisis, Media, and Power. Her website is hannamorris.com, and there's no H on the end. Her name is spelled Hanna. Oh, before I get to the some other question I had. I just wanted to congratulate you on getting your book published with Oxford University Press. Like that is the top for an academic. Were you like, were you just floored when you got the news that Oxford University Press was going to publish basically your dissertation?
Yeah, I mean,
You
talk
went to
about,
the straight up top. Like,
I mean, that's the thing. I feel like, I got the advice, just go for it. Just go for
yeah,
it.
I
I've
wouldn't
had
even try that. I wouldn't even have tried. So that's awesome because if I were you, I'd be like, oh my God, I'm so getting tenure and promotion like at Oxford University Press. Yeah, I just wanted to
so
congratulate you on on that because I think that's really cool. Okay, so in I want to read something from the introduction of your book. It says, and this is a quote, "This book illuminates how these old ways of traditional journalism fall short of what is required to contend with the unresolved grievances of the past and the societal and climatic shifts of the present. Traditional journalists are failing to grapple with the complexities of climate change and are deepening, as opposed to investigating, the false equivalencies, myths, and politics of enmity that propel apocalyptic authoritarianism at the expense of more robustly democratic alternatives." End quote. So, Dr. Morris, tell us more about like what are news outlets doing that's problematic in covering the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think that it's, I know how I don't want to going back to my beginning where I really for my whole life has have really admired media
Yeah.
and I understand how difficult it is doing journalistic work, especially with authoritarian threats and Trump saying journalists are the enemy of the people. And
Yes.
it's just and also constant defunding of newspapers and there's not a
Yes.
lot of resources to do these investigations. So it's a part of a larger um, it's a part of a larger problem. So it's not just necessarily journalists themselves,
Right.
but because of this constant defunding, this constant kind of defensive posture that journalists almost need to take because they are being under attack and they are being questioned. I found that there is this, because there's this defensive posture, understandably so, but there does tend to be, I think, in reporting and also a lot of um, editors who are giving public statements, and also publishers like A.G. Sulzberger, who's the publisher of the New York Times, for example, is consistently and constantly sort of defending these traditional modes of journalism, these old ways. And this is, in a way, a bit reactionary too. And it's really closing off what could be another reckoning with seeing, okay, well, how is it that why do a lot of people not trust these mainstream publications anymore? Maybe there's been too much movement away from people on the ground and what's happening. Maybe it's too elitist. Maybe it needs to be more accessible. And so a lot of the journalism that I saw in this really fraught period where there was a lot of anxiety around the future of the US. So, Trump's presidency in 2016, I mean, I remember it was just like this real question of like what's the future of the US, and that's happening again now. And so all
Yes.
of these real anxieties, and journalists are a part of that. They're people, they're part of it, and they're feeling these anxieties. And I think a lot of these anxieties have impacted reporting though, and this nostalgia and this looking backwards and this sort of wanting an us versus them and a clear, these are the
Mhm.
enemies. These are who we need to remove to get back to the stability of the US, get back to what we know. And I think that limits a real deep understanding and investigation of how we got here, why Trump has so much appeal, and then what we can do about it and how we can combat this authoritarianism. And that involves, I think, dispelling with these old ways and thinking about, okay, how can journalism right now respond? What needs to change?
Yeah, it's and that's coming also at the same time, even regardless of the climate crisis, just this there's so many changes in journalism as everything goes digital or and it's hard for journalists to kind of compete with podcasts and all these different things. But there's also this sense that journalists don't know how to cover all the lies and the disinformation that are coming out of political elites at a much greater rate than we ever used to have too. And so I think you also hear a lot of critique about journalists can't use the same way of covering politics that they used to with a figure like Trump who's constantly lying and saying obnoxious things that a lot of traditional politicians wouldn't say. And so they're not going to get the coverage because they're not, if you're not obnoxious, then you're not going to get the coverage. So the more outrageous you are. So anyway, I mean, that may not have been a part of your book, but that's also part of it. We're also hearing that traditional journalism is also not meeting the moment because that they argued that also that's how Trump got elected is he gets more media coverage than like in this case it might be Kamala Harris because she's not being, weird, honestly. And she's not saying outrageous lies and calling people losers and, all these things. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's also I feel bad like what is journalism supposed to do in a situation like this with so much disinformation and just like yeah, just clownish posturing that's happening, distracting from important things.
Yeah, I know it's not an easy time to be a journalist. And I think again, it makes sense that in with all of this, that there is a nostalgia
Yeah,
that you see because of trying to remember a time before, because of wanting to find a path out of this.
yeah,
And so it's understandable. But I think that there could be a different response besides just looking backwards and actually really looking and seeing and coming together with people who are trying to figure out how to combat these authoritarian threats and how to have politics that it isn't as violent as Trump and isn't as reactionary and isn't as vitriolic and it's sort of been sad to me to see, sort of really notable publications like the New York Times, instead of, leaning in and covering and engaging with these really important progressive movements, is consistently dismissing fear-mongering, calling them violent, repeating Trump's talking points and saying they're violent, almost, sometimes even repeating Republican um, quotes that are really not qualified in any way, framing young activists as terrorists. And
uh,
so it's disappointing to see how this falling back on old ways, though, really is entrenching these traditional figures of power as opposed to really reporting and seeing how times are changing. People are
yeah.
changing. And so you really need to engage with more people as opposed to just closing even more, just appealing to elite and privileged few in
And
reporting.
some of that kind of getting to some point you made earlier is what since journalists or news outlets are so they're kind of defensive because also Trump in particular constantly, as you mentioned, refers to them as the enemy, but he also is saying that they are constant. Well, a lot, the Republican Party in general tends to say the news media is liberal, it's progressive, it's biased, it's biased, it's biased. And so, and the news media prides itself on some notion of objectivity, or I like to say fairness or diversity in viewpoints. So do you feel like that also is the reason that they push a little bit more to the conservative side because they have to kind of prove that they're not? Whereas if we were all saying, hey, the news media, the New York Times and everybody, they're too conservative, which is kind of in a way what you're actually claiming. If we said that, then maybe they would like open up to things and instead of feeling like they have to push more conservative or moderate so they're not accused of being
Yeah.
too liberal. You know, like it's a perfect thing for the Republicans to do to force then the media to kind of say, "Oh, okay, well, I'll cover you with in a more favorable, the Republican Party in a more favorable way so that
Yeah.
you don't critique me."
I think that gets back to your point too about how just, a lot of journalism for so long in these old ways and these traditional ways have really repeated and amplified these elite figures. So
Yeah.
political representatives and traditional experts and but now, like you said, with it leading, just outright lies or just really violent, dangerous discourse. Yeah, journalists are still relying on their old ways of reporting and repeating what's being said from the White
Yeah.
House.
Like both sides kind of like, "Oh, this is what the
Yeah, like
Democrats say, this is what
exactly.
the
And so they
Republicans
have
say."
to because
Yeah.
of what we're saying. Like, they have to report on that because then they would be accused of being biased.
Right.
And so they're trapped, but then it's moving further and further and further to the right and further and further in an authoritarian direction. And so there has to be a reckoning. There has to be something that journalists
Yeah.
do. And there are methods and proposals for different ways of doing journalism. So there can be change. It doesn't need to be just amplifying these really dangerous statements coming out of the White House.
And for you've mentioned some solutions, but I don't know if you want to kind of plug any particular ones, and if you think that like this is something that commercial mainstream journalism can do. By commercial, I mean, like CNN and the New York Times, as opposed to just independent, non-commercial media. But like, can your mainstream news outlets that are commercial for-profit entities do what you're saying and maybe what are you saying they should do?
I mean, that is it's difficult to say if commercial media can in its current form, but I think that there's a lot of opportunity to change funding models. Like we mentioned, there's been so many difficulties in adapting to for years now. It's not
Yeah.
new, but adapting to digital and social media. And newspapers constantly saying they're in a state of financial crisis and, cutting more staff positions, cutting investigative funding, really preventing this robust reporting from happening. So, there can be different funding models where it's includes more people and it's more maybe collectively run, it's more locally based.
Mm.
And, there's a lot of different avenues. And I think again, there's though this wanting to protect this what is seen as traditional journalism, but at what cost? Maybe preventing investing in more local alternatives or, really different ways of organizing newsrooms. And what I found really inspiring and hopeful in a way is this new project that the Covering Climate Now initiative has started. It's called the 89% Project, and the Covering Climate Now initiative started actually in 2019, which I mentioned is the year that climate change kind of trended. And so it was this initiative started among some pretty famous climate journalists who wanted to create this forum to encourage and provide resources for more climate reporting at this moment in 2019, where there was attacks on journalism and climate science by Trump. And again now, so there's been kind of a resurgence
Yeah.
in this Cover Climate Now initiative with Trump's new presidency. And they started now in this Trump 2.0, what they call the 89% Project. And the 89% Project, 89% is referring to lots and lots of polls, which I mentioned, all these polls that are coming out showing that people want robust government-led responses to climate change. And so um, they collated a lot of different studies and saying that, okay, 89% of people in the world actually want more robust responses to climate change that are government-led. And so the question is, why is that such a shocking thing to hear? Why is it something that's so unknown? That the majority of people want to do something about climate change, but government-led and robust. Why is this still something that a lot of people don't realize is true? And why are newspapers still not reporting on this? Why are newspapers still not engaging with these 89% of people?
Mm.
Why is it still repeating Trump's denial or these traditional figures that are romanticizing about World War post-war period? Why are all of these people left out of news coverage? And so the 89% Project, I think, is an encouraging sign that maybe there is some reckoning happening among climate journalists, and there is this understanding of a need to do things differently, and maybe the old ways aren't working, and who are these 89% of people? That's a huge
Yeah.
statistic.
Yeah,
So
I shared that Covering Climate Now project with my media ethics class each year too. So that's encouraging to them because it's also important for our journalism students to feel a sense of encouragement. So I appreciate that. And speaking of encouragement and wrapping up, what can listeners do, Dr. Morris, to encourage fair climate coverage from news media they consume or media they produce?
yeah, I mean, I think supporting, again, I mentioned local media, local
Yeah.
journalism, like the radio show, and just in general, really seeing journalism as a public service and something that people should be engaged in and should be active in writing letters to editors, writing opinion pieces, trying to get involved, supporting local community media, and really reforming these collective ties that have been broken over so many years of fear mongering and anxieties and the hatred that Trump is really stoking, really supporting media and reclaiming these spaces to build alternative visions and directions for politics. And media, again, just getting back to us in the beginning, is super important, super powerful, and need to sort of reclaim that space even more and more is really, really important.
I like that. Now, I'm going to add an extra question here just for our podcast listeners, but this won't fit into the radio show timing. But just since I mentioned in the beginning of my intro to this podcast and radio show, I mentioned how you brought in manifest destiny or kind of like a colonial viewpoint. I just wanted to ask you, how does that relate to this discussion, or how does that old identity of America as like the colonists having a right to kind of go across the continent, as if we were improving it by removing wildlife and the wild animal predators and the native humans who are here and their culture. Like, does is I mean, most people wouldn't say, "Well, wait a minute, how does that relate to something we're talking about today? Do we still have that kind of colonial identity? Are we embracing that still?"
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I thought was super interesting and what sort of pushed me to introduce this idea of apocalyptic authoritarianism too, because of this framing of the Trump years. So the first Trump years now again, but the 2016, after his election, the 4 years that followed of his first term, there is this cordoning off almost of these years as being exceptionally extreme, like a blip in time. That was going to be resolved eventually, and we'd return on the US would return on its exceptional journey of manifest destiny. We'd continue being a moral example for the world. Trump really, caused a lot of questioning of if the US can be a moral example,
Yeah.
kind of blowing up that image of the US being a leader. And so there was this positioning of the Trump years as being its apocalypse, but the chosen people would make it through in the end and continue on in their manifest destiny. And that, I argue in my book, closed off again, like I said before, like closed off this reckoning of how Trump came to be. It was a very material political reality. And by not reckoning with how this authoritarian culture in the US emerged, it really prevented in the Biden years that followed this real need to build coalitions across difference. There's real need for different, way of doing politics and change. And instead, this sort of deep engagement with how we got here and what can be done about it was elided in a lot of ways. And, Trump is back again. And and so I think this myth of exceptionalism and manifest destiny reemerges at times to sort of say, and it's sort of comforting myth saying, we're going to get out of this period. It's extreme, but eventually, we're going to get out of this. But that's not certain,
Right.
it's really not certain, and it prevents a lot of necessary democratic coalition building and and really preventing authoritarianism from rising, which we're at great risk of right now.
Right. Yeah, we need to get you on some more podcasts so you can share your political vision, because there's a lot of people strategizing now on how we how we should move forward. And so hearing your deep insights on this, I think is would be very useful for people as we do political strategizing. And you bring kind of a deep rhetoric analysis to this and understanding the historical context that I think would be useful. So I hope that you get a lot of other interviews related to your book for that.
Thanks. I hope so
Yeah.
too.
Well, that's the end of our show, but I want to thank you, Dr. Hanna Morris, for being with us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. Thank you for your work as an environmental communication scholar, helping us understand how journalism can be more effective at covering the climate crisis to foster needed social and ecological change. Take care, and I look forward to seeing you in Tasmania.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, I'm just going to play a little game here and add in the sound of a Tasmanian or Australian animal and see if you can identify the species. This is him eating and then sneezing. Okay, if you think you know which species that is, email me at carrie@wrfg.org, CARRIE at wrfg.org, and let me know. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to In Tune to Nature, broadcasting every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, online at wrfg.org, and on Atlanta radio station 89.3 FM. I record from Atlanta in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in the Muskogee Creek Territory and former range of the Red Wolf. You can access action items, my email, and podcasts on the show's website, wrfg.org/intune-to-nature. The views and opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board, staff, or volunteers. I'm one of those volunteers. I'm host Carrie Freeman, asking you to please support independent, non-commercial media like Radio Free Georgia. And remember to take care of yourself and others, including other species. Thank you for listening. Cheers.